I want you to take a second and really, just really try to put yourself in a highly specific, but honestly, an incredibly common scenario.
Oh, absolutely. Like, we've all been there at some point.
Right. So I'm talking about sitting right in the middle of a routine, just totally mundane 6-hour overnight flight.
Oh, the classic red eye.
Exactly, the red eye. It was the kind of journey where everyone around you is just utterly exhausted,
Yeah.
right? People are trying to fold their bodies into these impossible, uncomfortable angles just to catch, well, a few hours of sleep before morning.
Yeah, that terrible neck cramp you get from sleeping on the tray table.
Exactly. And the cabin lights are dim, casting that very artificial soft blue glow over rows of sleeping strangers. And you can hear the steady, reliable white noise hum of the jet engines right outside the fuselage.
Which is actually a very comforting sound when you're up there.
It really is. And maybe there's a bit of weather going on, right? Like some heavy rain beating in thin horizontal streaks against the double-pane glass of your small window. Sitting there, it feels safe. It feels like a sealed, climate-controlled, flying cocoon.
Right, you're insulated from the outside world.
But right now, I want you to imagine pressing your forehead against that cold glass, cupping your hands to block out the cabin glare, and just, looking outside into the night.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And as your eyes finally adjust to the dark, you realize something totally impossible. You realize that the world outside, and I don't just mean the clouds or the ground below, but the entire physical universe as you understand it, has completely vanished.
Wow. I mean, it's the absolute pinnacle of isolation, right? Think about the fundamental trust we place in the physical world.
Yeah.
You are suspended in a pressurized metal tube, traveling at hundreds of miles an hour through the troposphere, and suddenly the very concept of outside ceases to exist.
It's just gone.
Right. There is no reference point left, no altitude, no horizon, no destination. Just you, the fragile aluminum shell of the aircraft, and, well, whatever has replaced the reality you thought you were moving through.
And that absolute, paralyzing existential terror is exactly what we are exploring today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thrilled to be here for this one.
So our mission today is to unpack a deeply unsettling, intensely detailed horror narrative about the terrifying and bizarre fate of Flight 217.
That's quite the story.
It really is. We're looking at a commercial aircraft that somehow veered off its designated flight path and fell into this supernatural cosmic abyss, something the source material refers to as the feeding route.
And what's really compelling about this narrative is how it takes the mundane, everyday anxieties of modern air travel like claustrophobia or turbulence or just loss of control and stretches them into something ancient and predatory.
Yeah, it really weaponizes those normal fears.
Exactly. We're looking at a story of cosmic consumption. The aircraft itself isn't just crashing. It becomes a physical morsel, slipping down the digestive tract of a reality-warping entity.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really do this justice, we're going to trace the exact timeline of the plane's descent. We're going to follow this flight from the initial, barely noticeable turbulence all the way down to its final cosmic doom.
Step by step.
Step by step. But crucially, what makes this specific account so uniquely terrifying is the soundscape.
Oh, the sound design of this story is incredible.
It's wild, right? We are going to be focusing heavily on the shifting auditory cues inside the cabin. Because as the visual world outside disappears, the sounds, and sometimes the horrifying absence of sound, are what actually signal the total breakdown of reality itself. We're going to listen closely to how the world ends for Flight 217.
And the emphasis on acoustics here is vital because human biology is wired so that when our visual input is compromised, like, say, being in a dark cabin on a night flight, our auditory cortex becomes hypervigilant.
Oh, that makes sense. Like when you hear a twig snap in the woods at night.
Precisely. Our brains desperately search for auditory patterns to map our environment. And the narrator of this event intuitively understands this. The entire descent into horror is charted not just by what is seen, but by the physical vibration of sound.
The mechanical noise is failing, the dead silence.
Yeah, all of those terrified moments.
We have to start at the baseline, right? The illusion of normalcy.
Yeah.
Flight 217 is supposed to be perfectly, boringly normal. A standard 6-hour overnight haul.
The kind you sleep right through.
Exactly. And the source mentions heavy rain before takeoff, which I love as an auditory detail right off the bat. If you've ever flown in the rain, you know that sound.
Oh, absolutely.
The drumming of the water on the fuselage, that muffled roar of the weather outside, contrasting with the climate-controlled quiet of the cabin. Within the first hour, the narrative tells us the cabin lights are dimmed. Most of the passengers are already asleep. The engines are just humming softly.
And setting that auditory baseline is crucial here. That steady hum of the engines is literally the heartbeat of the aircraft.
A heartbeat.
For the human brain, as long as you can hear that specific frequency, you know the machine is converting jet fuel into thrust. You know physics is still actively applying to your situation.
Right, the math is still working.
Exactly. You are safe in the cradle of modern engineering. It's a sound that signals civilization and, ultimately, survival.
But right from the jump, the narrator gives us this creeping unease. They specifically note an inability to sleep and just this lingering, gnawing gut feeling that something about this flight felt wrong from the very beginning.
Just a bad vibe.
Yeah, a really bad vibe. And I find this fascinating because it's not a logical fear based on like a flashing warning light,
Yeah.
It's an instinctual one, like how my dog somehow knows a thunderstorm is coming 3 hours before the first cloud even rolls over the house.
That's a great comparison. There's a very real biological precedent for that. In psychology and neuroscience, we look at the concept of thin slicing.
Thin slicing.
Yeah. It's the ability of our unconscious mind to find patterns in situations and behavior based on extremely narrow windows of experience. The narrator's brain is processing micro cues that their conscious mind hasn't even registered yet.
What kind of micro cues?
Yeah.
Are we talking about like shifts in the plane's movement?
Exactly. It could be a subtle shift in the vibration of the floorboards under their feet, or it could be infrasound low-frequency sound waves that human ears can't technically hear, but which our bodies physically feel as pressure.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Doesn't infrasound make people feel paranoid?
It does. It's known in acoustics to induce feelings of profound dread and anxiety in humans. Or, perhaps the cabin air pressure is fluctuating in a microscopic way that doesn't trigger the automated oxygen masks, but it causes the inner ear's vestibular system to send a distress signal directly to the amygdala.
So their body knows before their brain does.
Exactly. The conscious mind says, I'm on a plane, everything is fine, read a book. But the unconscious mind is screaming, the environment is hostile, we are in danger.
And that unconscious screaming gets entirely validated at exactly 2:13 a.m. This is when the turbulence starts. But the source material is incredibly careful to distinguish this from the kind of turbulence you and I are used to.
Right, it's not normal rough air.
Not at all.
Okay.
It wasn't violent. It wasn't the plane shaking or dropping suddenly into air pockets, spilling drinks everywhere. It was just strange. The narrator says the plane suddenly felt heavier, as if an enormous mass was pressing against the entire hull from the outside.
Consider the mechanics of what turbulence actually is. Traditional turbulence is chaotic. It's the unpredictable movement of atmospheric air currents, or thermals, or wake vortices, buffeting the aerodynamic surfaces of the plane.
Right, it tosses the aircraft around randomly.
Exactly. But what is described at 2:13 a.m. is a sustained, deliberate application of force. It's not chaotic energy, it's directional pressure.
I was trying to think of how to describe this feeling. Here's the best analogy I can come up with. Tell me what you think.
Let's hear it.
Imagine you are driving a car down the highway at 60 miles an hour. You know exactly how that feels, right? The slight resistance of the wind, the high-frequency vibration of the asphalt.
Sure.
Now imagine driving that same car at that exact same speed directly into an invisible standing wall of deep water. The physical laws governing your vehicle instantly, violently change.
Oh, wow, yeah.
You are still moving forward, but you are completely surrounded by a suffocating external pressure. The actual medium you are traveling through has fundamentally altered its density.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the physics of this transition. It's an environmental phase change. They have passed from the thin, forgiving atmosphere of Earth, the troposphere, into a medium that is thick, viscous, and deeply oppressive.
The drag coefficient on the aircraft is just skyrocketed.
Skyrocketed. And if we look at the timeline, the very next event confirms that their connection to our reality has been completely severed.
Because immediately after this heavy pressing sensation hits the plane, the first major technological failure happens inside the cabin. Every single screen shuts off at once.
Just goes totally black.
Yeah, the seatback movies, the digital flight maps tracking their tiny plane icon across the globe, the overhead display, everything just dies simultaneously. Black screens across the board.
The psychology behind this moment is severe. Think about modern commercial flights. Those screens are our digital umbilical cord to the outside world.
They really are. People panic when the Wi-Fi drops for 2 seconds.
Exactly. The moving map is a spatial anchor. It tells us exactly where we are relative to the Earth below. The movies and TV shows are cognitive distractors, designed to keep us from thinking about the unnatural reality of sitting in a tube 30,000 feet in the air.
When you lose the Wi-Fi on a flight, people instantly get antsy. But losing all the screens at once in the dark.
It triggers an immediate sense of isolation. When those screens die in perfect unison, it plunges the cabin into a deeper, more primal darkness. But on a larger scale, it severs their connection to the global grid. They are no longer a blip on a radar over the Atlantic or tracking toward a destination. They are digitally untethered.
They don't exist anymore.
Exactly. It's the very first calculated step in a process of sensory deprivation. The entity, whatever environment they've entered, is systematically trapping the passengers in the immediate claustrophobic physical space of the cabin. You can no longer look away into a screen. You are forced to look at where you actually are.
But the weird thing is, when the screens die, the panic doesn't start immediately. Instead, there's this deeply unnatural, almost contagious calm that washes over the cabin.
Unnatural is the right word.
Right. The narrator watches a flight attendant walk down the aisle. But she isn't rushing to reboot the systems, and she isn't checking on confused passengers. She is smiling. And the Force specifically notes she is smiling too calmly.
Red flag.
Huge red flag. She's walking slowly down the aisle, leaning over, and softly whispering to the passengers, "Please keep your window shades closed."
If we analyze this against standard aviation procedures, her behavior is terrifying. In the event of a total power loss to the entertainment systems, combined with a sudden, abnormal atmospheric pressure shift, a flight crew is trained to be alert, communicative, and professional.
They secure the cabin, they don't whisper.
Right, they don't whisper. This flight attendant, however, is displaying the effect of someone who is heavily sedated, or worse, someone who is no longer operating under human imperatives.
The whispering really gets under my skin. Like, why whisper during an emergency?
The whispering is a vital auditory cue. It enforces the quiet. It's an unnatural dampening of human reaction. It demands that the passengers conform to the silence that is beginning to settle over the plane.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's almost a predatory tactic. Keep the prey calm so they don't alert whatever is outside.
It's incredibly cult-like, this forced serenity in the dark. And most people, because they are half asleep, disoriented, and socially conditioned to follow the authority of the flight crew, they just accept it. Nobody pushes back.
They just conform.
But the narrator looks over at the old man sitting next to them, and this guy is the complete opposite of the calm flight attendant. He is terrified. He is sweating profusely. His hands are trembling, and he leans over to the narrator and whispers. Again with the whispering, he says, "Don't let them see you looking outside."
The old man is functioning as our early warning system here. His physical reaction, the heavy sweating, or diaphoresis, combined with the tremors, is a pure, unadulterated, autonomic nervous system response to mortal terror.
He's literally shaking with fear.
His amygdala has fully hijacked his brain. He somehow intuitively knows the rules of this new environment. And notice the phrasing. The rule isn't keep the shades closed because there's bright light.
Right.
The rule is do not be observed. He frames the act of looking outside as an act of exposure. It's the classic abyss staring back.
And before the narrator can even begin to process what this terrified man means, the bottom falls out. Literally, the plane suddenly drops.
Here we go.
And this is where the soundscape of the story becomes incredibly jarring, almost violently so. Because when a commercial jet suddenly loses altitude, you get the expected sounds of mechanical and human chaos.
Streaming, things breaking.
Right. Passengers screaming in the dark, overhead bins rattling violently, luggage shifting, the plastic and metal of the cabin groaning under the sudden shift in G-force. But then, instantly, absolute silence.
The acoustic contrast is what makes that moment horrifying. You have this massive crescendo of human panic and structural stress peaking at maximum volume, and then it is severed.
Like a physical wire being cut.
Exactly like that.
The engine stopped, and the text is highly specific here. It says they didn't fail, spinning down with a whine or a sputter. They stopped, like a massive switch was flipped off, and yet impossibly the plane kept moving forward.
Which completely defies the laws of aerodynamics.
Wait, hold on. I really need to wrap my head around the physics here. If you are in a massive multi-ton metal tube and the engines completely cease functioning, but you aren't falling out of the sky like a rock, are you even flying anymore?
That's the question, isn't it?
When a plane loses engines, it becomes a glider, right? It descends at a steady glide ratio. But they aren't gliding down. They're maintaining a forward trajectory.
Exactly. A Boeing or Airbus without thrust is just a very heavy glider losing altitude, but the narrative states they kept moving steadily. What we're seeing is the complete suspension of aerodynamic principles. Thrust has been eliminated, but forward momentum, or perhaps it's better described as a forced trajectory, continues.
Okay, so it's not flying.
The hum of the engines, that auditory baseline of safety we discussed, is dead.
It sounds like they aren't propelling themselves through the air. They're being dragged through the dark, like a ship caught in a massive deep-sea current or caught in a tractor beam.
Dragged is the perfect verb. They have lost all mechanical autonomy. The aircraft is no longer a vehicle navigating a route. It is a captive object being pulled.
Wow.
The silence of the engines isn't just the absence of noise. It becomes a heavy, oppressive presence in the cabin. It is the acoustic signature of the void they've entered. It is the ultimate proof that human engineering has been rendered entirely irrelevant.
And it's in that dead, unnatural silence that the realization hits the passengers. People realize the engines are gone. They're looking around desperately in the pitch black, calling out for the flight attendants.
Panic sets in.
But the crew, the smiling woman, everyone else has vanished. Every single one of them is just gone from the cabin. We're plunged into this terrible leadership vacuum. And right on cue, as if responding to the panic, the emergency lights kick on automatically. The entire cabin is flooded with this dim red lighting.
Let's look at the psychology of that visual shift. Red lighting fundamentally alters the emotional state of the space. It removes the comforting, sterile blues and whites of commercial travel and replaces it with the universal visual language of a critical emergency.
Like a siren, but visual.
Exactly. Think of a submarine diving deep to avoid attack or a surgical bay in crisis. It bathes the remaining passengers in a glow that subliminally suggests blood, alarm, and total system failure.
And then the intercom crackles softly overhead. This is where the sound design of this story just goes completely off the rails into nightmare territory.
It's so unsettling.
Because normally when things go wrong in the air, the intercom is your lifeline. It's the captain's voice, calm, authoritative, telling you they are handling the turbulence or the diversion. It's the ultimate source of comfort.
Right, the voice of reason.
But first, the speakers emit a burst of white noise static. Then, emerging from the static, is the sound of breathing. Slow, deliberate, heavy breathing broadcast over the PA system. And finally, a voice whispers through the speakers, "Keep the windows closed."
Consider the psychoacoustics of this moment. The intercom is a mechanical conduit meant for human authority. But it has been hijacked. And what is it transmitting? Not instructions from a pilot, but visceral, biological sounds.
Breathing.
Breathing. A whisper. The auditory cues have shifted entirely from the mechanical and inorganic to the organic.
It implies that the plane isn't just traveling through an empty space anymore. It feels like it's traveling inside something living.
Precisely. The plane's internal nervous system, its communication network, has been integrated into the entity that has captured them. And the intimacy of breathing over a loudspeaker is profoundly violating.
Oh, it really is.
It's a paradox of scale. The threat is outside the massive plane, yet its voice is intimately whispering directly into your ear from the speaker above your seat. It breaches the psychological boundary between the external threat and the internal sanctuary. The call is quite literally coming from inside the house.
And the passengers are starting to break under this pressure. The cabin is entering a state of absolute psychological denial. There's a woman near the back of the plane who is completely snapped. She is crying hysterically, and she keeps repeating this one deeply profound phrase over and over in the red light. "There's no sky. There's no sky."
From a psychological standpoint, that phrase is existentially devastating. She isn't shouting, "We are crashing," or "The engines are dead." She is vocalizing the realization that the universe they belong to has been deleted.
Yeah, she gets it.
"There's no sky" is the ultimate expression of agoraphobia, the fear of vast, empty spaces combined simultaneously with total claustrophobia. The infinite familiar expanse of the atmosphere above them has been replaced by an infinite alien nothingness. Her spatial orientation, her understanding of up and down has collapsed.
And human curiosity, or maybe just the sheer desperate refusal to accept the impossible, forces someone to break the one rule they've been given. Someone near the backs suddenly reaches up and violently shoves their window shade open.
It's the human instinct to gather visual data. When auditory data is confusing, they need to see the threat.
But the moment that shade goes up, the entire cabin freezes instantly.
Ah.
Everyone stops what they're doing
Yeah.
because out that window, the crying woman is proven completely right.
There really is no sky.
There are no clouds, there are no stars, there is no moon, there's not even the faint ambient glow of the atmosphere. It is just infinite, thick darkness. But far, far below the plane, there are these tiny lights moving slowly. The narrator describes them as looking like sprawling cities underwater.
Notice the specific imagery used there. When you fly at night on a normal route, looking down at city lights is a deeply comforting experience. It reminds you of civilization, of a grid, of a destination waiting for you.
Home.
Right. But framing them as cities underwater introduces the physics and biology of the deep ocean, the bathypolitachic zone. It subtly suggests to the listener that they are not looking down at a terrestrial landscape, but peering deep into a pressurized, lightless trench.
Like the Mariana Trench.
They're looking into the Mariana Trench of reality, where the only light comes from bioluminescent predators.
And the illusion of those comforting city lights is shattered in the most horrific way possible. Because one of those distant glowing city lights down in the dark suddenly shifts. It moves and it looks up.
Oh, man.
And the passenger looking out the window realizes it isn't a sprawling metropolitan grid at all. A gigantic singular eye has just opened in the darkness beneath the plane.
The scale of that image is almost incomprehensible to the human brain. Think about the inverse square law of light. For an eye to be large enough to be mistaken for an entire city grid from an altitude of thousands of feet, what does it take to illuminate an organ that massive?
I can't even imagine.
It introduces the true, godlike scale of the cosmic entity they're dealing with. And it instantly validates the old man's desperate warning. The danger isn't just in looking outside and seeing something scary. The danger is in being seen. It is the terror of being perceived by a predator.
The passenger screams, obviously, and slams the plastic window shade shut immediately. But it is way too late. The narrator explicitly says something had seen us. And the physical reaction of the environment to being observed by this massive eye is instantaneous. The entire plane suddenly tilts sharply sideways.
The gravity shifts.
People who aren't buckled in are thrown out of their seats into the aisle. And amidst this violence, the yellow oxygen masks drop from the ceiling.
The oxygen masks dropping is a fascinating detail. Why do they drop? Because the plane's automated barometric sensors detect a catastrophic anomaly in pressure or altitude.
So the plane still thinks it's a normal emergency.
Exactly. The plane's internal computer is still blindly trying to execute its safety programming, completely unaware that a lack of oxygen is the absolute least of their problems. It highlights the tragic futility of human engineering trying to mitigate cosmic horror. It's a mechanical reflex, a dead twitch of the aircraft systems.
But the tilt and the masks aren't even the scariest part of this sequence. It's the new sound that follows. Because the moment that giant eye locks onto them, a new auditory layer is added to the nightmare. Along the outside of the aircraft, just inches from their heads, they start hearing these long, slow, agonizingly heavy scraping noises.
The scratching.
Scratching sounds moving methodically across the external aluminum metal of the fuselage.
Let's synthesize the soundscape in this exact moment because it is brilliant. Inside the cabin, you have absolute chaotic human auditory data. You have people praying aloud in panic, uncontrollable, hysterical crying, screams of pain from passengers who were thrown into the armrests.
It's just overwhelming noise.
It is hot, messy, emotional noise. But outside the plane, separating them by only a few inches of metal and insulation, you have this cold, methodical, deliberate scratching.
What's the purpose of the scratching? Are they trying to cut in?
Not yet. It is the sound of something completely alien testing the structural integrity of the container. Think of a predator tapping a shell to see if the meat inside is accessible. Oh, that's a horrible thought.
The stark contrast between the hysterical internal noise and the calculating, almost curious external noise is deeply terrifying. It tells the passengers that their panic is entirely irrelevant to the thing that is investigating them.
It's exactly like tapping a fingernail on the glass of a terrarium.
Yep.
The bugs inside are losing their minds, running in circles, and you are just slowly dragging your nail across the glass to see how they react. Which brings us to the intruders and the total loss of humanity.
The figures outside.
Yeah. So they have scraping on the outside metal, screaming on the inside, and then shapes begin moving outside the small passenger windows. The narrator describes them as tall, pitch-black figures flying silently alongside the plane. They're described as being too large, stretched, and too thin.
Very uncanny valley.
And they briefly press their faces against the double-paned glass. Their skin is pale gray, and their eyes are completely, solidly black. If the massive eye below is the primary predator, these figures seem to act as the remoras to the great shark, or perhaps antibodies within the digestive system they've entered. They represent the immediate, localized, man-sized threat compared to the macro threat below.
But they are flying right next to a plane, like just keeping pace.
Which further reinforces that the physical laws of inertia and aerodynamics have completely collapsed in this space. They are spectral entities, unbound by drag or wind resistance, yet they possess enough physical density to press their pale faces against the glass and look inside.
And the plane's hijacked communication system reacts violently to them. The intercom crackles again, but this time the soft, organic whisper from earlier is gone. The voice is unbelievably loud. It is heavily distorted, physically blowing out the overhead speakers with feedback, and it screams a single command: do not let them inside.
This is a fascinating behavioral shift in the entity controlling the intercom. Earlier, it whispered calmly to keep the windows closed, aligning with the sedated flight attendant. Now, it issues a frantic, technologically distorted warning.
Why the change?
It suggests a fracture in the entity's control, or much more likely, a sadistic psychological game. It's mimicking the role of a desperate human pilot, giving an absolutely impossible command.
Exactly. I've read that and thought, what are they supposed to do? Don't let them inside. How? I can't lock the doors from row 14.
You're completely helpless.
And immediately, the sheer cruelty of that command is revealed. The heavy emergency exit door over the wing suddenly autonomously unlocks by itself. The handle turns and it just pops open into the dark. The physical breach happens.
The seal is broken.
And the sound of this is described as an acoustic explosion. Freezing cold air roars into the cabin. The pressure differential causes absolute chaos. People are screaming as unsecured luggage, jackets, and debris just fly everywhere. The heavy silence of the dead engines is instantly replaced by the deafening hurricane-force roar of the void rushing in.
Let's talk about the physics of explosive decompression. At cruising altitude, if a door opens, the pressurized air inside the cabin violently rushes out to equalize with the thin atmosphere outside. It should rip the interior apart.
Right, everyone gets sucked out.
But here, the vacuum of whatever space they are in is actively invading the pressurized cabin. The sensory overload here, the massive drop in temperature, the hurricane winds, the deafening white noise, is a biological tactic meant to disorient and paralyze the prey. The sealed capsule is officially broken. The sanctuary has been compromised.
And amidst this absolute hurricane of chaos and flying debris, the narrator looks toward the open emergency exit. And standing outside in the roaring, freezing wind, literally standing on the wing or just floating in the empty air, is a flight attendant.
The same one from earlier.
It's the exact same one who was smiling and whispering earlier. But she has undergone this grotesque, horrific transformation. The narrator specifically says she isn't human anymore. Her smile is stretched impossibly wide, physically tearing the muscles of her face wide, and her skin is fluttering in the violent wind like torn paper. And behind her, hovering out there in the dark, are dozens of those tall, black-eyed figures just silently watching the open door.
The visual of her skin fluttering like torn paper is particularly horrific. And it speaks to the mechanics of this realm. It suggests that her human biology has been completely hollowed out.
Like she's just a husk.
Yes. Her physical form is now just a flimsy suit, a disguise being worn and puppeteered by something else. The entity has assimilated her mass and is using her remains as an interface to communicate with the passengers. There is a deep-sea fish called the anglerfish that uses a glowing appendage to lure prey in the dark.
Oh, I hate anglerfish.
She is the anglerfish's glowing lure dangling outside the open door to invite them out.
And what does this torn paper puppet say? Over the deafening roar of the wind, she calmly whispers. And somehow, defying all acoustics, her whisper can be heard perfectly clearly over the hurricane noise. She whispers, "We crossed too far."
We crossed too far. It's an admission of transgressive navigation. In ancient maritime history, cartographers would draw monsters on the edges of maps with the warning, "Here be dragons."
I love that phrase.
It meant, do not sail past this line. The laws of the known world end here. This flight didn't just experience a mechanical failure. They sailed off the edge of the multidimensional map right into the dragon's territory.
And this is when the physical abductions began. But they don't happen the way you would expect in a traditional horror movie. The tall creatures hovering outside don't storm into the cabin, grab people by the ankles, and drag them out kicking and screaming.
It's much quieter than that.
The text says the process is methodical, instantaneous, and entirely silent. Passengers sitting near the windows just start disappearing. They aren't pulled, they are just gone, completely erased from their seats in the blink of an eye, and the only evidence left behind are wet handprints on the fabric of the seats.
The sudden, silent absence of a human being is far more disturbing than a violent struggle. A struggle implies a contest of strength. This implies a power so absolute, so fundamentally dominant over reality, that it doesn't even need to fight its prey.
It just deletes them.
It simply removes their physical matter from the universe.
You know what the wet handprints make me think of? It makes me think of the physics of condensation. When you have a really cold glass of ice water sitting on a table on a hot summer day, and you pick it up to move it, you leave behind a ring of water, a damp imprint of where the object used to be. It feels like these passengers didn't just walk away or get grabbed through the door. It feels like they suffered a rapid, unnatural phase change.
Like sublimation, where a solid turns directly into a gas, skipping the liquid phase entirely.
Exactly. The moment they were observed by these creatures through the windows, the moment the dark looked directly at them, their physical carbon-based matter just melted out of reality, leaving behind nothing but the damp, energetic residue of their existence on the seat cushions. It's not murder in the traditional sense, it's physical deletion.
A rapid phase change induced by observation is a brilliant way to describe the mechanics of this space. They were solid matter, and then they sublimated into the void. The old man, who is still violently trembling and clinging to the narrator's arm, understands this mechanism perfectly.
He figures it out fast.
He grabs the narrator and whispers his realization: they're taking the people who looked outside. The act of observation is a fatal two-way street here. By looking out into the void, you invite the voids to look back at you. And being perceived by this entity collapses your physical state.
Which sets up the most universally terrifying moment in the whole story. Because if looking outside voluntarily gets your physical matter deleted, what happens when the plane decides to force you to look? Out of nowhere, the mechanical whirring of the plane's internal motors starts up, and every single window shade in the entire cabin slowly, automatically opens at the exact same time.
Think about the systemic stripping away of their defenses. Those thin pieces of corrugated plastic were the only psychological and physical barriers separating the passengers from the cosmic horror. And the entity controls the aircraft's electrical grid completely.
It's forcing them to see.
By raising all the shades simultaneously, the entity is forcefully exposing the entire cabin to its gaze. It is removing the blinders.
And what they see when the shades go up is why everyone left in the cabin starts screaming instantly. Because the infinite darkness outside isn't empty anymore. It is filled with faces. Thousands and thousands of faces completely surrounding the aircraft, just floating out there in the black vacuum, silently keeping perfect pace with the plane.
Just horrifying.
Some of them look entirely human. Some of them definitely do not. But all of them, every single one, is staring directly into the cabin windows. And they are all smiling.
We are witnessing the mobilization of the entity's collective consciousness. Those human faces might be previous victims, passengers from other flights who crossed too far decades ago, now biologically assimilated into the hive mind of the void. And the smiling is the most perverse, psychologically damaging detail.
It's so wrong.
A smile is a universal human signal for safety and welcome. Here it projects a predatory joy. It's the smile of a trap that has successfully snapped shut.
And as these thousands of smiling faces watch them through the glass, the plane begins a very steep, deliberate descent. It's going down towards something enormous. At first, looking down through the dark, the narrator thinks it looks like that glowing underwater city again. But then the horrifying shift in perspective hits. The lights down below aren't buildings. They are millions of individual eyes. Millions of glowing, colossal eyes opening up beneath them in the darkness. The plane is literally sinking into an endless ocean of staring eyes.
It is a landscape composed entirely of perception. In our world, the environment is inert rock, water, and gas. In the feeding route, the environment itself is biologically alive, and it is entirely focused on them. We are moving from the localized threat of the floating faces at the windows to the macro threat of the dimension itself being a sentient, hungry observer.
And while they're sinking down into this ocean of eyes, the intercom decides to start mocking them again. It crackles, and the voice delivers this twisted, perfectly replicated corporate airline messaging. It whispers over the screaming passengers, "Thank you for choosing us."
So sadistic.
And then a few moments later, it adds this truly devastating, self-aware line. Some flights never arrive anywhere human.
The entity is utilizing the mundane, bureaucratic vocabulary of customer service to psychologically torture its prey. "Thank you for choosing us" is the standard comforting script you hear when the landing gear touches down safely at JFK or Heathrow.
Right, it means you survived the trip.
Hearing it broadcast as you descend into a dimension of millions of giant eyes highlights the total absurdity of their situation. The constructs of human civilization, airlines, schedules, safety regulations, safe arrivals, are being weaponized against them as a sadistic joke.
And the old man finally pieces the entire puzzle together. He turns stark pale, looking like he suddenly remembers the hidden mythology of this place, and he whispers his major lore drop to the narrator, "We left the route!" The very microsecond he says that, as if the plane itself heard him acknowledge the absolute truth, all the power fails entirely. The cabin lights shut off, the emergency red lights die, the plane is swallowed by absolute, suffocating pitch blackness.
The old man's realization, "we left the route," is profound. It implies that what we consider safe airspace is actually just a very narrow, incredibly fragile corridor of safe passage through a much darker sky.
Just a tiny thread.
A human route carved through a hostile wilderness. And surrounding that fragile corridor is the feeding ground. The power shutting off completely is the final curtain falling on their visual reality.
But the darkness doesn't stay empty for long. Tiny, bioluminescent lights begin appearing inside the dark cabin. At first, the narrator thinks they are beautiful. They describe them as looking like small floating lights drifting peacefully above the passengers' heads, almost like fireflies trapped in the cabin.
A false sense of wonder.
Completely. But then one of them drifts a little closer to a passenger's face, casting a faint glow, and the narrator sees what it actually is. It's an eye. A disembodied human-sized eye, still wet, still blinking, floating through the air all by itself. And then hundreds more appear, drifting silently down the aisles, weaving between the seats, watching everyone in the dark.
This is a critical escalation of the physical invasion. The entity isn't just looking at them from the outside through the windows anymore. It has manifested its physical gaze inside the sealed cabin.
It's among them now.
The sensory deprivation of the pitch black is instantly replaced by the hypersurveillance of these floating eyes. The boundary between the inside of the plane and the outside void has completely dissolved.
And just to confirm exactly what is happening, the intercom whispers its most chilling, clinical line, yet observation has begun.
This raises an incredibly important question, and it's something we really need to dive deeply into to understand the mechanics of their doom. What does observation actually mean in this specific cosmic context?
Because it's obviously not just looking.
Because if we look at quantum mechanics, specifically the double-slit experiment, the very act of observation literally alters the physical state of the thing being observed. Human perception collapses a wave function into a particle. Schrodinger's cat is both alive and dead until the box is open and a conscious observer looks at it.
So you're saying the void's gaze is acting like a quantum observer?
Exactly. Here in this supernatural abyss, observation is not a passive act of just gathering visual data. It is a predatory, digestive act. Being perceived by this primordial darkness is fundamentally altering and consuming the physical, carbon-based forms of the passengers.
That's horrifying.
The floating eyes are not just watching them panic, they are digesting their reality through perception. They are breaking down the quantum state of the human passengers simply by looking at them.
That makes so much sense, and it perfectly explains why looking outside made people sublimate into wet handprints earlier. Or locked eyes with the void, and the void's perception instantly collapsed their physical state. Now the void has brought its eyes inside the cabin, and it is looking at everyone at once. This moves us from observation to actual physical digestion. The narrator notices that all these hundreds of floating eyes suddenly stop drifting. They turn in perfect unison. They all look toward the very front of the cabin, toward the cockpit door,
Odd audience waiting for the show.
like they're responding to a master signal from the brain.
They're orienting toward the control center of the aircraft, which is about to reveal who or what is actually flying the plane now.
The heavy, reinforced cockpit door slowly clicks and swings open, and the narrator has a clear line of sight inside. There are no pilots. The captain's chairs are empty, but the cockpit itself isn't empty. The small room is filled entirely with a shifting, moving darkness, and from inside that tight space, the narrator can hear the incredibly loud, slow breathing of something that is described as being far, far too large to physically fit inside the room.
We are dealing with a spatial paradox here. This is non-Euclidean geometry, where dimensions on the inside of a space do not match the physical boundaries on the outside.
Like a bag of holding in a fantasy game, but evil.
The entity is so massive that it is extruding just a tiny microscopic portion of its mass into the physical space of the cockpit, acting as the grotesque pilot of this doomed flight. And the breathing coming from the cockpit connects perfectly back to the breathing we heard over the intercom earlier. The entity has physically seated itself at the helm of their reality.
And from that moving darkness in the cockpit, a distorted, unnervingly calm voice emerges. But it isn't using the intercom anymore. It is speaking organically, directly into the cabin air. It says, "Thank you for remaining seated during transition." This is the moment the old man finally breaks down completely. He stops shaking, he starts crying quietly, and he names the exact place they are in. He whispers, "This is the feeding route."
Transition is the operative word. They are no longer traveling from point A to point B on a map. They are undergoing a biological and existential state change. They are transitioning from living, autonomous beings into pure sustenance.
Into food.
And the old man's naming of the feeding route confirms the ecological, predatory nature of this horror. It's not a random accident or a Bermuda Triangle anomaly. It's a mechanism. It's a trapdoor built into the sky specifically designed to catch stray aircraft and funnel them into a cosmic digestive system.
And the physical deformation of that digestion begins the second he says those words. The terror stops being psychological and becomes violently, agonizingly physical. Suddenly, the entire plane shakes. Massive concussive impacts hit the underside of the aircraft.
The teeth are closing in.
The narrator says it felt like giant hands physically grabbing the fuselage from below. And there's a very specific, intense auditory detail here. Metal screamed loudly beneath our feet. The solid aluminum floor of the cabin actually begins bending and buckling inward.
The screaming metal is the acoustic frequency of the plane's structural integrity finally failing under the physical grip of the monster. The entity is squeezing the tube. Think of a human hand crushing an aluminum soda can before drinking the last drop.
That image is brutal.
The tactile sensation of the floor bending inward beneath their feet forces the passengers to realize that the impenetrable, engineered shell they trusted with their lives offers absolutely zero protection.
And as the plane is being physically crushed, the biological assimilation of the passengers hits hyperspeed. People sitting near the windows start disappearing again, one after another, gone in an instant, but this time leaving deep, wet fingerprints smeared on the glass. But the most horrifying part of the assimilation is what happens to the plane itself.
The body horror.
The ceiling panels above the passengers begin to bulge downward, stretching like rubber, as if something enormous is crawling through the aircraft's internal wiring and insulation. And then, human faces start pressing outward from beneath the solid metal ceiling.
Fusing organic and inorganic material. This is a profound escalation of the body horror.
It's completely insane. Human faces are trapped inside the solid metal of the plane. Some of them are screaming silently, their mouths open in agony, or others are smiling that same wide, impossible, torn paper smile. And one of the faces pushes through the metal just far enough to look down to the narrator and whisper, "Don't let it open your eyes."
If we connect this back to the quantum observation theory we discussed, it reveals the true horrifying nature of the digestion process. The passengers aren't just being eaten in a traditional biological sense. Their matter, their souls, their very physical forms are being fused into the architecture of the void.
They become the plane.
The plane itself is being infected by the entity, and the previous victims are now literally part of the fuselage. The warning, "Don't let it open your eyes," suggests that the final stage of consumption involves forced perception. The entity will physically peel back your eyelids to make you look upon its true form. And that influx of impossible visual data is what finalizes your assimilation into the metal and the dark.
So, my hypothesis here is that the plane isn't just being broken apart to get to the chewy human center inside. The plane itself is being digested. The aluminum, the plastic trays, the copper wiring, it's all being merged with biological, cosmic horror.
A total synthesis.
The passengers are becoming the upholstery, the ceiling panels, the walls of the feeding route. The machine and the meat are being blended together into a single, agonizing, living structure.
I agree. The evidence strongly supports that. The aircraft is no longer a separate manufactured object. It has become a digesting organ of the entity, actively processing the humans within it. And this integration of the machine's electrical and mechanical systems against the humans leads to the most treacherous, heartbreaking betrayal in the entire narrative.
The seatbelt trap. My God, this part made my stomach drop into my shoes. Amidst all this crushing metal and screaming faces pushing through the ceiling, the plane's automated safety features turn incredibly deadly. The digital seatbelt signs above the seats autonomously ding and light up, and instantly, every single passenger's seatbelt tightens violently.
Do you know how an airplane's seatbelt mechanism actually locks during a crash?
I assume it just pulls tight.
It relies on an inertial reel system. When there is a sudden, violent deceleration like hitting the ground, the reel physically locks the belt in place to keep you from flying forward. So for every single belt to violently tighten and lock simultaneously while the plane is just hovering or descending steadily implies that the entity has completely hijacked the electrical grid and the mechanical safety systems of the plane itself.
They don't just hold them. The belts cut deeply into their bodies, forcefully restraining everyone to their seats. They're completely trapped, pinned down for the final consumption, and right as the belts lock them in, the intercom whispers its final, horrific flight announcement, preparing passengers for landing.
It is the ultimate perversion of safety protocols. The very device engineered and mandated by human law to keep you secure in a crash is repurposed by the entity to bind you for the slaughter.
You can't even try to run.
You cannot run down the aisle. You cannot hide in the lavatory. The machine that was supposed to protect you is now holding you down on the cutting board. The announcement of landing is the entity signaling that the journey down the esophagus is complete and they have finally arrived in the stomach.
Which brings us to the climax of the descent. The passengers are pinned to their seats, suffocating under the pressure of the belts. And suddenly, all the windows in the cabin brighten simultaneously. A massive light source appears outside.
And you just know they shouldn't look.
Now, the human instinct is to look. It's biological nature to look toward a sudden light source in pitch darkness. But the text says that anyone who looked outside immediately started bleeding profusely from their eyes. The sheer visual information of what was outside was so physically damaging, so incomprehensible, that it literally ruptured the blood vessels in their eyes.
Think of it like pointing a digital camera sensor directly at the sun without a solar filter. The hardware literally burns out because it lacks the capacity to process the sheer volume and intensity of the incoming data.
The brain just short circuits.
The human optical nerve and the visual cortex of the brain cannot process the geometry or the reality of the primordial being. Looking directly at it causes catastrophic biological failure. The light they see isn't illumination. It is the destructive, unfiltered radiation of a godlike monster.
But the narrator manages to catch a glimpse, or perhaps the entity forces them to see just enough. Outside, the endless darkness has opened up. There's a gigantic circular shape surrounding the aircraft far down below. The narrator says it's larger than an entire terrestrial city. At first, given everything else they've seen, they think it's just another massive eye. But then the shape blinks sideways, and they realize it isn't an eye, it is a mouth.
A mouth larger than a city. The scale is staggering. It reduces the commercial airliner to a speck of dust.
A mouth with rows of endless teeth stretching through the darkness beneath the plane, opening wider and wider, just waiting for the plane to fall in. And to accompany this apocalyptic visual, the soundscape shifts one last time. The intercom voice, which has been whispering or distorted or mocking this entire time, suddenly becomes joyful. The text says it sounds almost excited. It chimes in over the speakers, "Welcome to Final Approach."
The joy in the voice is perhaps the most chilling auditory detail of the entire descent. It is the sound of pure predatory anticipation. The hunter finally has the prey in its jaws. The long, slow terror of the psychological descent is over, and the physical moment of consumption has arrived. The corporate sterile mask of the airline announcement is finally paired with the genuine hungry excitement of the beast.
And in this moment of massive cosmic scale hovering over a mouth the size of a city, the horror suddenly becomes incredibly, uncomfortably personal and intimate, because inside the cabin, every single one of those hundreds of floating human eyes suddenly turns and looks directly at the narrator. They all blink together.
Just staring right at them.
The old man, who is pinned in a seat next to them, bleeding from his eyes, grabs the narrator's wrist desperately and whispers his final words, "It noticed you."
Amidst the mass casualty event of an entire airliner being swallowed, the entity singles out an individual consciousness. The horror shifts rapidly from the macro, the destruction of the metal plane, to the micro, the soul-deep violation of being individually perceived, isolated, and claimed by the monster.
It's so isolating.
It noticed you means you are no longer just part of the anonymous herd being swallowed. You are the specific morsel it is focusing its tasting on.
And as if to punctuate that horrifying personal connection, the plane suddenly stops descending. It just freezes completely in the dark, hovering in midair right above the endless rows of teeth. And in that frozen, heavy silence, there is a gentle sound, a soft tap, tap, tap on the outside of the narrator's window.
After the roaring wind of explosive decompression, the screaming of bending metal, the chaotic noise of hundreds of people panicking, returning the soundscape to a gentle, singular tap on glass is a masterstroke of pacing.
It's so quiet.
It draws the focus entirely from the massive mouth below to that single fragile pane of glass beside the narrator's head.
The narrator turns their head slowly. Pressed against the glass is a wet human hand. Floating outside the plane, unaffected by gravity or the void, is the flight attendant again. She still has her impossible, wide, torn paper smile. Her eyes are completely black, and she just looks directly at the narrator, and very slowly, she points her finger downward, toward the giant mouth waiting below.
She is acting as the psychopomp, the mythological guide to the underworld, officially gesturing them into their grave. She is ensuring that the prey fully comprehends exactly where they are going before the final drop.
And when the narrator follows her finger and looks deep down inside the open mouth beneath the aircraft, they don't just see an empty throat. What they see is a graveyard of eternity. Falling silently through the darkness inside the massive mouth are thousands of other planes, old prop planes from the 1940s, brand new commercial jets, broken fighter planes, just an endless shower of metal tubes falling forever into something alive beneath reality itself.
This is the grand reveal of the feeding route's terrifying history. This entity has been skimming the skies for decades, perhaps centuries, collecting lost flights like a whale filtering krill. It explains the ecosystem of the void.
It really does.
It is a cosmic filter, catching the debris of human aviation that accidentally slips through the cracks of reality. The sheer volume of planes falling inside it speaks to the relentless, eternal, insatiable hunger of the creature.
It's the ultimate horrific answer to every aviation mystery ever recorded. And as the narrator takes in this massive falling graveyard, the intercom crackles for the very last time. The joyful, excited voice whispers its final send-off into the cabin. "We hope you enjoy eternity with us." The seatbelt tightens even harder around the narrator's chest, cracking ribs. The plane tilts its nose sharply downward, and Flight 217 begins its final fatal descent into the living darkness below.
It is a perfect, terrifying conclusion. The illusion of the flight is maintained right up until the literal moment of consumption. The implication is that they aren't going to just die on impact. They are trapped in an eternity of falling, being slowly digested over centuries within the belly of a cosmic god, constantly reminded by the architecture around them that they chose to fly.
Okay, let's take a deep breath, because that is an incredible amount of psychological and physical horror to process. We have just traced the complete sensory overloading descent of Flight 217.
Quite a journey.
We went from a mundane, rainy takeoff, feeling that weird, heavy bump in air density at 2:13 a.m., to the complete severing of the digital umbilical cord when the screens died. We listened as the mechanical, comforting hum of the engines was replaced by the organic, heavy breathing over the PA system. We explored the physics of explosive decompression and the biological horror of phase changes and quantum observation, until finally the passengers were securely strapped into their seats by hijacked safety features to be swallowed whole by a city-sized mouth beneath reality.
What sticks with me is how this narrative expertly exploits the inherent, unspoken vulnerabilities of modern travel. When you step onto a commercial flight, you are actively surrendering all of your physical autonomy.
You give up total control.
You are placing absolute blind trust in the fragile aluminum tubes surrounding you, the complex physics of aerodynamics, and the invisible corridors that air traffic control maps across the night sky. This story asks the terrifying question, what happens if that trust is fundamentally misplaced? What happens if the invisible route we trust so much is actually just a thin silk thread stretched over a predator's web and a strong wind blows you slightly off course?
Exactly. And that leaves us with one final, deeply unsettling thought to chew on before we wrap up today's deep dive. We know from the old man's lore, and from that terrifying final visual of the graveyard of planes falling into the maw, that this cosmic entity feeds on flights that veer off course. It has a collection of thousands of old, new, and broken planes endlessly falling inside its giant mouth. When you think about that staggering scale, it forces you to look at real-world aviation history a little differently.
It absolutely recontextualizes the unknown.
How many famous missing flights in our own history? The ones that vanished from radar screens without a single trace, where rescue teams scoured the oceans for months and never found a single piece of floating wreckage, a black box, or a drop of fuel. How many of them didn't actually crash into the sea at all?
It makes you wonder.
What if they simply slipped off the human route, experiencing a heavy, unexplainable bump at 2:33 a.m.? And the next time you find yourself on a red-eye flight, sitting in the dark while everyone else is asleep, pressing your forehead against the cold glass of the window, staring out into the pitch-black night. How will you really know if that steady hum you are hearing is still the engines, or if the total silence of the feeding route has already begun?